most folks think science fiction, they think really complicated astrophysics, or they're thinking something about really unique alien biology. And while those things are fun, there are also other really cool ideas in science fiction. And that's what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about a real theory in linguistics that really asks the question, what if language and the words that we choose and how we construct our sentences could actually change reality? Let's talk about 10 books that play with this idea. All right, you guys, so let's talk about this real linguistic theory. This is a hypothesis called the Sapir-Whorf Hypothesis, and it is interpreted in two different ways. One of the ways has somewhat been disproven, and the other way is one that is still being played with today. So let's talk about the stronger way, and that's called linguistic determinism. This is something that's popular in older books and really deals with the fact that a certain language or certain types of vocabulary or sentence structure can actually change reality around you. I'm sad to say this is one that, while it's a really cool idea and there's been some incredible books about it, this is something that has been disproven, sadly. However, there is a more moderate interpretation of this theory that is still around today, and this is called linguistic relativity. Now, linguistic relativity means that it doesn't necessarily limit reality, it doesn't restrict reality or create reality, but it can change your perception of something. So the example of this is a real life example. Apparently, Russian has 3 different words for different shades of blue. And so men in Russia can very easily tell the difference between these different shades, whereas men in other languages sometimes can't even tell the difference between the shades of blue. They also use an example that the Inuit language has a multitude of words for lots of different kinds of snow. And so when they step outside, they don't just say it's snowing, they have different words for different kinds of snow. And this changes their perception without having to think about what is going on around them. Now, this idea is one that will pop up in several of these books, but it is really fun to play and see what would happen if, and what happens if we continue to play around with language, and how language could really hold some power in an untapped potential. So let's talk about some of these 10 books. The first and maybe oldest book on this list is going to be The Languages of Pow by Jack Vance. This small book follows the people of a very traditional and very passive people on an alien world in a far-flung future, and we find out that the main ruler is assassinated. And so we follow 2 points of view perspectives: the son, who is supposed to inherit but ends up exiled and training off planet as a linguist in a different world. And then we also follow the uncle, who assumes power and has hired some of the linguists to try to create a cultural revolution within his society. Now, this is a very interesting book and deals directly with linguistic determinism, as it changes not just the culture, but also the reality and nature of the people themselves. This is a really kind of a flat character story that is really more about the ideas than it is about the character, but I would say that that's pretty Jack Vance for you. Luckily, this is a nice short little story that I thought was very interesting. There were a lot of really interesting ideas that were batted around with this and how it does and doesn't work on this planet. So if you're interested in just a book based off of pure linguistic determinism, this is the book for you. Now, that being said, I want to move to another book that is famous for its linguistic determinism, and that is going to be Babel 17 by Chip Delaney. This book follows Captain Rydra Wong. Say that 10 times fast. And she is a former codebreaker turned poet and also telepath who is asked to investigate this intercepted message coming from an alien world. And they're thinking that it's a particular code, and it turns out to be a very interesting alien language. And as Wong begins to learn the language, it has lots of interesting effects. And Miss Wong goes around meeting other people who also know this language, who also are experiencing these unique effects. This book is directly dealing with linguistic determinism, and the language itself changes reality itself. Now, I'm not going to tell you how or why, but trust me, this book is really fascinating because it feels very science heavy, even though it's actually about this Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Now, fair warning about this book, as a Delaney book, it is very weird and out there, and not everyone gets along with Chip Delaney's writing style. I'm sad to say that I myself am not a huge fan, so this one was particularly hard for me to get through, but there are lots of people who love this story, and it is one that very much rewards a reread of this story. Next, let's talk about The Embedding by Ian Watson. This is a relatively unknown book that is a rather famous UK author I had never heard about. It is kind of an unsung classic of linguistic determinism, and it's separated into 3 distinct stories. We follow how language can affect not just our perception, but the reality of space-time. So we follow Chris in the first story, who is a linguist who starts embedding a very interesting constructed language into a group of orphans. And as they learn and the language continues to evolve, it may actually change their consciousness. Then we follow Pierre, who is an anthropologist who finds a tribe in the Amazon who has this 2-tiered language that ends up having hallucinogenic effects. And finally, we get to the sci-fi aspect of this story, and we follow the Spathra, an alien race who finally make first contact with humanity, only to find out that all they want is to learn all of our languages. And they go around the universe collecting languages to hopefully unlock the realities and the secrets of the universe. So this book is definitely one of those kind of feels like a fix-up novel that really talks a lot about 3 different perspectives of how language and words can shape us. And this was not too big of a story, so for those of you out there who are interested in a smaller book, this one might be for you. All right, now let's get into some modern science fiction that deals with this topic. The next 2 books are some of my all-time favorites, and they are rated probably the most highly of all of the books I'm going to talk about today. The first one is going to be one that is a relatively recent read called Native Tongue by Suzette Elgin. This one happens in a far-flung future where we have contact with many different alien species around the galaxy. And there are only 5 human families, known as lingos, that have successfully been able to teach their children alien languages, to act as translators for all of the political events and things that happen throughout the galaxy. Now, despite this being a really interesting future, we do have tons of interesting technology, but we have regressed in one major civil way, and that is women's rights have been revoked. So that means women are seen as property in this particular future. We're following 3 points of view perspectives in this story, as it seems many of these books are. The first is a story of a woman named Michaela, who is bred as the perfect wife. She's gone through perfect wife training, and she's one of the best. She is using her wifing skills to enact revenge on all of the linguos and men that she can find for the death of her infant. We also follow a group of secret government male scientists who are trying at everything they can to replicate the success that the linguo families have by using experimentation on human infants to try and help them learn alien languages, to hopefully not need the linguo families so much. This includes throwing out some ethics. So if you don't love the idea of dead babies, maybe stay away from this book. The last point of view perspective in this story is a woman named Nazareth, who is a woman in the Linguo family. And we get to follow her plight and her everyday life as she goes about doing translation and learning the inside of what it looks like from the Linguo family, especially because the women are secretly creating a language intended for women only to be able to express what they've always wanted to say in this society but never been able to. And these three perspectives definitely come together in a way that definitely leaves it open for more books in this series. There are currently 3 books in the series, and I do believe it is done. But you absolutely can read just the first book by itself. What's really interesting about this story is it's not just a book about feminism or the patriarchy. And while there is some pretty heavy themes here in that, as well as some pretty heavy frustrations reading it, you will get to see a lot of philosophy in terms of language, how it's constructed, what it does for societies and cultures. And there are a lot of really interesting, nuanced themes. I was not able to put this book down. It is a 5-star read for me this year. So if you haven't heard of it or haven't picked it up yet and you would be interested in this kind of topic, I would definitely recommend it. Another more modern science fiction book that I had a equally fantastic time with, one that definitely makes my top 10 science fiction books of all time, is going to be the standalone Embassy Town by China Miéville. This is his most sci-fi work. In this future, we have colonized the galaxy, but we have only found one sapient non-human species in all the galaxy. This is called the Urukai. I might be saying those wrong. And despite us being fascinated with them and trying to make first contact, their language is so complex that we have not been able to make meaningful contact back. So they don't really acknowledge us as sentient or sapient creatures. And we're following a starship captain named Cho, who is falling out of love with her husband and decides to go back to the place where she grew up in Embassy Town. And in Embassy Town, she gets to witness the introduction of a new kind of ambassador to the Urukai, who finally makes meaningful contact back to these aliens. However, in doing so, may have actually broken and completely collapsed their entire culture. While humans are rushing to try to undo their great mistake with this new ambassador, they're also kind of forced down your throat to deal with how powerful and sometimes how negative language, emotions, truth, perception really is. And we're also forced to hold up a mirror and ask ourselves, is humanity selfish for making first contact? And do we destroy everything that we touch? This book was very dark and had a lot of themes of addiction and the worst parts of humanity in it in a way that I wasn't expecting. And of course, China Miéville always throws things at you from the side. So just so you know, it's gonna be a tough read, even though it's a rather short book. However, it is definitely worth it, and one that will definitely haunt you for a long time. Next, let's move on to some more lighthearted stories that deal less with the intensity of humanity. Let's start with Lexicon by Max Berry. This one reads a little bit more as a sci-fi pulp thriller kind of story, where we're following the investigation of Emily Ruff, who is a street urchin who was admitted to a secret school in Virginia and taught to manipulate language in just such a way that she can subtly manipulate reality. Is this a little bit of magic or is this science? I'm going to leave that to you. But she does the unthinkable during school and, of course, falls in love. And this causes lots of problems. We also get the alternative perspective of Will Jameson, who essentially is relentlessly and brutally pursued for unknown reasons. And after being finally beaten like the 3rd or 4th time, realizes that he might be the key to an ancient rivalry between the secret poets from the school of Emily Ruff and a forgotten town that has been blown up by a single word of power. There is a lot of stuff to unpack in this story, and it was very action-packed. There's lots of mystery. Although I will say, this story felt a lot more superficial than the other books that we've talked about in this video, so don't be expecting too many high hopes for this particular one. Another lighthearted and more modern one is a fun book called Drunk on All Your Strange New Words by Eddie Robson. This one follows Lydia, who is an average translator from an agency who is somehow ending up with one of the best assignments. She gets assigned to the alien Logi ambassador, and this is happening during a very intense political time, so there's a lot of stress on her and a lot of things that need to be translated. And what's really unique about this particular language is that when you're processing the language or converting it and translating it, the translators get drunk on the words. So she has lots of blackouts and lots of times what she doesn't remember. And waking up with one particularly terrible hangover, she awakens to find out that the ambassador himself has been murdered. And the only other person in the house is her, with no memory of what happened last night. So this is kind of a murder mystery investigation in a very unique and strange situation. So this one was a lot of fun. I was able to get through it in just a couple of days. It's not as heavy on the language, but it is one that deals with the idea that words can alter your perception and perhaps your memory. Next, we have to talk about two shorter works that deal with this specific topic. And then I have one that I'm going to count as kind of an honorable mention. So let's talk first about the short story, the one that I bet many of you have been waiting for me to mention, and that is The Story of Your Life by Ted Chiang. This is a short story, or perhaps it is a novelette, and this is the ideas that the movie Arrival was based on. So we're following the woman Louise Banks, who tells the story of how she met and contacted first aliens known as heptapods. And she was able to help learn and then also translate the language of the heptapods to help the military in their first contact. And in the meantime, we're also intertwining this with the story of the conception of her daughter. And the movie does a fantastic job of this, and it gets really convoluted, but I must say, if you haven't read this little short piece of work, it is really an interesting one. Although I shockingly like the movie a little bit more. Remember, you can always do some hate comments down in the comment section if you need to, but I guess that's a hot take. Now let's talk about a novella that came out just this year, actually just very recently. And it's called The Language of Liars by S.L. Huang. In a galaxy with no humans, we get to follow an alien named Ro, who is a linguist that has been recruited to become a spy and replace the consciousness of the most mysterious and also most valuable species in the known universe. These are the creatures that allow travel between the stars. And for some reason that nobody can figure out, they are no longer having young. And so the galaxy is starting to panic. So Ro's assignment is to use his linguistic knowledge to try to solve the social construct of these creatures and figure out why exactly they're not reproducing. I gotta say that this was a really interesting, fun, tight little novella that didn't have a whole lot of room for tons of subplots, but as we get to discover more and more aspects of these creatures, we have a gut punch of an ending that was a little bit of a twist that made me love this novella. So if you're looking for a shorter read, perhaps, to decide whether or not this is a topic that you're interested in, this would be the book that I would recommend for you. Next, I want to include a book that almost became my honorable mention, and this is a book called Vox by Christina Dalcher. This is going to be a more sci-fi thriller, potentially dystopian literary novel in a setting where politics have gone wrong and they enact laws that only allow women to speak 100 words per day. And this is enforced by a specialized necklace that they have to wear that will zap them for every word that they speak over to the point of unconsciousness. And of course, this necklace resets every day. We get to follow a woman named Dr. Jean McClellan as she watches this law go into effect, and slowly more and more rights are taken from women, including the right to hold a job or spend their own money. And as Jean is already married and she has 2 kids, a boy and a girl, she gets to watch not just how she deals with what's going on, but how her children start changing the way that they interact and think based off of the sex and gender of themselves. What's interesting about this story and what makes it not quite the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, but still about the power of language, is it's about what you don't say and suddenly making those 100 words the most effective that you possibly can. This story is, again, maybe not the deepest of all of the novels on this list. However, it is one that I couldn't quite leave off because kind of what you don't say is just as important as what you do. And I think that this book does a really interesting job of it. I also have to say that makes 2 books where we have the idea of language and controlling language going hand in hand with controlling women. And I think it's really interesting that these 2 are so intertwined. And finally, you guys, I have a bonus book that it was translated from Sweden. This book is called Amatka by Karen Tidbeck. This is a surreal dystopian style story where language actually sustains physical objects. Like, without speaking their name a certain number of times, the object itself will actually collapse into this gooey-like substance that no longer holds purpose or shape. And in a world such as this, we're following Vanja, a government worker in this world whose accidental negligence ends up leaving several of her possessions in goo form. And this forces her to call the extraction team because nobody is supposed to touch the goo. However, after a couple of episodes of incompetence or maybe negligence, she is also struggling through some mental health issues and discovers herself in the middle of the night standing in the middle of a pile of goo, of what once used to be some of her possessions. However, instead of contacting the extraction team, she finds out that the goop itself may not be as dangerous as she thought, and it takes her down a rabbit hole of self-discovery and also a little bit of conspiracy theory. This story is a little bit fun. It's also a little bit maybe sci-fantasy perhaps. It has those kind of ethereal, magical vibes, but it is directly dealing with linguistic determinism. So I thought I should definitely include it on this list. And that does it, you guys, for all of the books on this list. Let me show you a quick little review slide, so that way if you guys need to write down any of the books, or if you want to add any that I haven't mentioned here, please mention those down in the comment section down below. Thank you so much for putting up with my very eccentric and fun video idea. I had a really good time putting this one together, and I hope to see you guys in the next video. And don't forget to check out some other sci-fi videos that can be found here.